3 very unsettling, alone watching the horror movie horror stories. Saturdays were sacred to Briella, her sanctuary. After a grueling week of back-to-back meetings and endless deadlines, she lived for these quiet nights alone. It was her ritual: a warm blanket, a bowl of buttery popcorn, and a horror movie that would make her regret turning off the lights. But tonight felt different. The rain had been hammering against the windows for hours. The wind howled, shaking the old frames of her tiny apartment. Thunder rolled in the distance, low and threatening, like it was warning her of something. Still, she told herself it was perfect weather for a scary movie. The kind of night you could lose yourself in fiction without any interruptions from the real world. She curled up on her couch, the glow of the TV casting faint shadows across the walls. Her favorite fuzzy socks and oversized hoodie made her feel safe, invincible. Her streaming app suggested a new movie, The Forgotten. She hesitated, skimming the summary. A haunted house, strange whispers, and secrets better left buried. Sounds perfect, she muttered, pressing play. The opening scene was slow and atmospheric, the camera panning across a decaying mansion cloaked in mist. Briella leaned in, her popcorn untouched. The creaks of the floorboards, the faint whispers in the background. It all felt too real. The lights flickered, just for a moment. Briella paused, her eyes darting to the ceiling. She sighed, shaking her head. The building was old. Flickering lights weren't unusual. But tonight, it unsettled her. She tightened the blanket around her shoulders and tried to focus on the movie. On screen, the protagonist was exploring a dusty attic, flashlight in hand. The tension was palpable. Briella felt herself holding her breath, waiting for the inevitable jump scare. And then, the sound of the wind outside made her flinch. A loud crack rattled the windows, followed by a whistle through the gaps in the frame. She exhaled a shaky laugh. "Get it together, Briella," she whispered. But the feeling in the room had shifted. As the movie continued, her unease grew. The protagonist discovered an old mirror, its surface clouded with dust and grime. She wiped it clean, and Briella leaned forward, captivated. The reflection. It wasn't right. The protagonist's movements didn't match. The reflection was faster, jerky, almost inhuman. And then, a shadow appeared behind her, a figure, tilting its head unnaturally. Briella's heart skipped a beat. She knew what was coming. The jump scare. The music swelled. The screen darkened. Her TV glitched. Static filled the screen, loud and jarring. The sharp white light made her wince. "What the?" she muttered, fumbling for the remote. She hit the pause button. Nothing happened. She tried turning the TV off, but the static only flickered, cutting to black. Her reflection appeared on the blank screen. Her blood ran cold. She stared at it, her heart pounding. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but her reflection blinked. Briella hadn't. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she stood, her knees threatening to give out. The reflection tilted its head, just like the figure in the movie. "No. No, no, no," she whispered, stumbling back. The TV flickered again. The movie was back on. But something was wrong. The protagonist was gone. Instead, the screen showed a living room that looked exactly like hers. Briella froze. Every detail was identical. The gray blanket draped over the couch, the half-empty popcorn bowl, the rain streaking down the windows. And then, the camera moved. It panned across the room, stopping on the couch. On her. Briella was on the screen, staring back at herself. This isn't happening," she whispered, clutching the edge of the couch. The version of her on the screen stood up, slowly, unnaturally. She dropped the remote, her hands trembling. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into brief darkness. When they came back on, she saw it. In the corner of the room, near the shadows, stood a figure. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But its presence was suffocating. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to move, to run, but her body wouldn't listen. The figure was tall, its outline barely distinguishable from the darkness, but its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Her phone. Briella fumbled in her pocket, pulling it out with shaky hands. The screen lit up, but the display was distorted, icons twisting and warping like they were alive. The TV crackled. Her gaze snapped back to the screen. The figure on the couch, her distorted reflection, was walking toward the camera, toward her. A soft creak echoed through the room. Her head whipped around. The figure in the corner had moved. It was closer now, its hollow eyes burning into her. Briella's panic took over, and she bolted down the hallway. Her bare feet slipped on the floor, but she didn't stop. She threw herself into her bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her back pressed against the wood, her chest heaving. The room was pitch black, but she didn't dare turn on the light. She strained her ears, listening for any sound. Nothing. Her phone's screen lit up again, casting a faint glow. Her hands shook as she opened her messaging app, typing a desperate message to her best friend. "Help me. Someone's in my apartment." She hit send, but the message didn't go through. The screen went black again, and then a whisper. "Why are you hiding, Briella?" Her stomach dropped. The voice wasn't coming from outside the door. It was inside the room. Her breath hitched, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to know, but her body betrayed her. Her gaze shifted to the corner of the room, where the faint glow of her phone cast long shadows. And there it was, the figure. It stood motionless, its head tilted, a smile stretching across its hollow face. The lights went out completely. Briella's scream pierced the darkness, but it was swallowed whole. When the lights returned, the apartment was silent, empty. The TV flickered, rolling the end credits of The Forgotten. But Briella was gone. All that remained was her blanket, neatly folded on the couch, and the faint sound of static whispering her name. This is creepy. Alone watching the horror movie Horror Story number 2. The air was still. Too still. Nolly settled into her couch, pulling the thick blanket over her legs. The TV flickered to life, casting a soft glow in the dimly lit room. She sighed, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had been gnawing at her all evening. Alone on a Friday night, she decided to watch a horror movie, her favorite escape. But tonight, something felt different. The wind howled outside, rattling the window. Nolly glanced at it, her heart skipping a beat. Shadows danced across the walls as the tree branches swayed in the gusts, scraping against the glass like fingers trying to get in. Scratch, scratch. She shook her head. It was just the wind. Or was it? A moment later, she heard the faint sound of the TV, a character in the movie screaming in terror. But she wasn't paying attention to the screen anymore. Her eyes were fixed on the window, where those shadows. They didn't look right. They seemed too deliberate. Scratch. Scratch. Her pulse quickened. She stood up and moved closer to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. Nothing. Just the empty street and the flickering street lamp. The same scene she'd seen 1,000 times before. Calm down, she told herself. It's just your imagination. But the unease remained. She turned back to the living room, pacing nervously. Her eyes darted to the front door, then to the hallway. The house felt too quiet, too empty. There should have been the soft hum of the refrigerator or the low rumble of the traffic outside, but tonight, only silence. Just as she was about to sit back down, something caught her eye. Something out of place. The blanket on the couch. It wasn't right. It was messed up, like someone had been sitting there. Her throat went dry. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. No one's been here. I'm alone. She tried to convince herself, but the thought felt hollow. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She took a deep breath and decided to distract herself. The movie. Focus on the movie. But just as she sat back down, the air around her shifted. The temperature dropped, and a cold draft swept through the room. The TV screen flickered again, casting eerie flashes of light on the walls. Her eyes caught a movement, a figure, just outside the window. It was gone before she could register it fully. Nolly's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the window, her pulse racing. The figure was just a shadow. Just a shadow, she told herself. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. She stood up quickly, moving toward the window again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She pulled the curtains apart and looked outside. Nothing. But she wasn't alone. She could feel it. The oppressive weight of something. Watching. Waiting. The trees outside swayed in the wind, and the street lamp flickered. The night was too quiet. Too still. And then she saw it. A handprint. On the window. Her breath caught in her chest as she took a step back. The glass was cold against her skin as her hand hovered over the handprint. It was smudged, like someone had pressed their hand against it. She stared at it, unable to move, as the fear slowly crept in. She wasn't alone. Something was here. The wind howled again, louder this time. She could hear it rattling the windows, the eerie creaks of the house settling in the cold night. And then there was that sound again, the scratching. Scratch. Scratch. Was it outside? Or was it inside? Her heart thudded in her chest as her mind raced. The handprint was still there, mocking her, as if to say, "I'm not just watching you, I'm inside your space now." She quickly backed away from the window, but her gaze lingered. The trees outside seemed to shift in the darkness, as if something was moving just out of sight. She shook her head, trying to shake the image of a figure. A figure, hiding in the shadows. The room felt even colder now. The silence seemed louder. The hairs on her arms stood straight up, and she could feel the pulse in her neck thundering in her ears. The curtains fluttered in the wind. The TV screen flashed again, but it was no longer the movie. The screen was black, except for the eerie reflection of the room. But there was something strange about the reflection. A shadow. It was standing behind her. She whipped around, but there was no one there. Her breath hitched in her throat. Did I see that? Was it real? Or was her mind playing tricks on her? The room seemed darker now. The walls closed in. The house felt like a cage. Noli bolted toward the front door. She had to get out. She had to leave. But as her hand reached for the doorknob, the door creaked open, by itself. Her pulse spiked. Someone was inside. She spun around to face the empty living room. It's just me. But it wasn't. The blanket on the couch, the one that had been disturbed earlier, was now completely on the floor, crumpled into a heap. And the TV. The TV was still on, showing a dark, empty hallway. But this time, there was someone at the end of it. Someone watching her. Her mind screamed at her to move, but her body was frozen. She could feel the cold creeping up her spine as her heart hammered in her chest. There was no escape. No way out. And then, as she backed away slowly, the lights flickered out. The room was plunged into complete darkness. And the last thing she heard? The sound of the door slowly closing behind her. Click. This is most disturbing. Alone watching the horror movie Horror Story number 3. It was a quiet Friday night when Kyla decided to settle in for some alone time. The kind of night when the world outside felt distant, and all she wanted was the comfort of her small, familiar apartment. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of wind against the window, and the glow of the TV in front of her. It was peaceful. Perfect, really. She had been looking forward to this moment all week. A few hours to herself, to relax with a horror movie. The Haunting at Hollow Creek. It had been getting rave reviews for its chilling suspense. Kyla loved horror films. The way they made her heart race, the thrill of feeling scared, all while knowing she was safe. But tonight felt different. She snuggled deeper into the couch, wrapped herself in a blanket, and started the movie. The opening credits rolled, and she popped some popcorn. She was ready. The house was empty, save for the soft flicker of the TV, the shadows stretching across her walls in the dim light. The film started innocently enough. A family moving into an old house on the edge of town. A classic setup. The house was dark, cold, abandoned, and the atmosphere was perfect for a ghost story. But as Kyla watched, a creeping unease began to settle over her. She shook it off. It was just a movie, right? The family began to hear strange noises, creaks in the floorboards, whispers in the walls. Kyla felt a chill on the back of her neck. She glanced around her apartment, her home. Everything was silent, too silent. Her gaze shifted toward the window, where the wind had picked up, causing the branches outside to scrape against the glass. The noise was faint, but it sounded like tapping. Her stomach flipped. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. On the screen, the family was now investigating the strange noises. The tension was building. They discovered a hidden room in the basement, old photographs of people long forgotten, their hollow eyes staring out from the dusty frames. Kyla's heart began to pound. The hairs on her neck stood on end. The atmosphere in the movie, dark, unsettling, was making her feel uneasy. She paused for a moment, took a deep breath. Get a grip, Kyla. The wind outside howled, and she looked toward the kitchen. Her breath caught in her throat. There it was again. A faint whisper. Her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, looking around the room. It's just the movie, she told herself. But the feeling was there, so real, so vivid. She wasn't alone. The whispers were louder now, clearer. They seemed to come from behind her. She froze. The room felt heavier somehow. The air felt thick, cold. It was just the movie, right? But then the whispering stopped. And in the sudden silence, Kyla thought she heard something else. A door creaked. She snapped her head toward the hallway, her pulse quickening. It's nothing, she told herself. It's nothing. But deep down she knew. It wasn't nothing. The family in the movie was now on edge. They were hearing the whispers too, seeing shadows move in the corner of their vision. The fear on their faces mirrored what Kyla was feeling now. Suddenly she wasn't sure she was alone in her apartment. The air felt too still, too thick. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, longer, as if something, or someone, was there, just out of sight. Her breath caught in her throat as her gaze darted toward the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. She could have sworn she closed it before. Her hands were trembling as she set the remote down, stood up from the couch, and took slow, cautious steps toward the hallway. Each creak of the floorboards beneath her feet echoed louder in the silence. The whispering in her ears grew faint, then louder. She was sure she was imagining it. It's just the wind. But it was too real. Too close. The bedroom door was wide open now, and Kyla hadn't touched it. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stepped forward, her breath shallow. The room felt cold, unnaturally so. She turned on the light and her eyes scanned the room. Empty. She let out a sigh of relief. Just her overactive imagination. But then, her eyes landed on the bed. There, on the pillow, was a small scrap of paper. She stepped forward, her hand shaking as she picked it up. The handwriting was neat, but it had a frantic edge. You're not alone, Kyla. He's here, and he's been watching you. Kyla's blood turned to ice. She scanned the room again, her heart racing, the words on the paper burning in her mind. It's not possible. She was alone. But the message, the words were so real. She felt the weight of the silence pressing in on her. And then, as if on cue, the wind howled again outside, rattling the window, making the whole room feel like it was alive. Click. The bedroom light flickered, then went out. Kyla's heart stopped. She stared into the dark room, now bathed in shadow. And in the darkness, she heard something. A whisper. Soft, but clear. Kyla. She whipped around, but no one was there. The silence was deafening. The darkness, suffocating. She turned to leave, but then the door to the hallway slammed shut. The sound reverberated through the apartment, shaking her to the core. Her breath hitched, and she felt the panic rise in her chest. She was trapped. The whispers grew louder, frantic, as if something was closing in on her. Kyla. She turned back to the room, her mind racing. She had to get out. She had to. And then she saw it. In the reflection of the bedroom mirror, a shadow, tall, dark, standing behind her. She gasped, spinning around. But when she looked, there was nothing there. Just the empty room. Just her reflection. But she could feel it. The presence. The weight of it. The shadow had been real. It had been there. You're mine now? The voice was distant, but clear. She could feel the cold breath against her skin. The air seemed to freeze around her, and just as quickly as it came, it was gone. The whispering stopped. The lights flickered back on. The room was still, silent, empty. Kyla was alone, but she wasn't sure she was alone anymore. She could still feel its presence, just behind her, watching, waiting. The fear, the terror, lingered in her chest, suffocating her, even after everything went quiet. The movie may have ended, but the nightmare, it was just beginning.